welcome to the Jada and Stitches show, and welcome to June. It's Calendar Blanket Friday. We're halfway through the year. It is time for the 6th Granny Square in this year's Granny's Magical Cupboard Calendar Blanket. We're making 12 Granny Squares this year for our Calendar Blanket series, one per month. We're into number 6, and this month we are going to tackle one of the super classics, the Irish Rose Granny Square. Now, the Irish Rose Granny Square comes in many different shapes and sizes. It is an old pattern, and it's been changed and augmented and made more fancy and less fancy over the years. Everybody kind of puts their own spin on the Irish Rose, but essentially what it is a three-dimensional rose that turns into a granny square. So it's not a rose attached to a granny square. It's a granny square built off of a three-dimensional rose. Really cool. And of course, I've added a little bit of Jada magic to this square to make sure that it fits with the rest of the squares in this series. Now, we start with the flower itself. The flower is 3 rows, and then we build the square on top of that. So there's a little bit of trickery that's going to happen in your brain. I want you to think of the rose and the rest of the square as 2 different things that come together to make a single square. There's no sewing here. We do build the square directly onto the rose, but the rose happens in 3 rows, and the granny square part is 4 rows. So rows 4, 5, 6, and 7. But technically, this is still a 6-row granny square, and you know that because there are 6 shells across the one side of the final row. Like the rest of the squares in this series, every single row of the granny square comes out to the same stitch count, so that you know by the time you get to the end of the square, all of your squares are going to sync up. Well, because this is the Irish Rose and it's a little different, the rose sort of takes the part, or takes the place of the first 2 rows of a regular granny square. So rows 4, 5, 6, and 7 of this month's square are technically exactly the same as rows 3, 4, 5, and 6 of a regular granny square. I will explain all of this as we get into it. It's not nearly as complicated as it might sound at front. Basically, you're creating a traditional granny square off of a 3-dimensional rose. Now, I'm going to do a 3-color square today. This one, I am starting with a yellow rose. I love yellow roses. And then I am going to stripe it in blue and white, but I've got 2 other ones. I have the other sort of denim blue and gold pairing that I've been using, and I just did 2 rows per color for the square part. So I started with a golden rose. I did 2 rows of blue and then 2 rows of gold, and I kind of like the way that one looks. But I did a 3rd one for you. Again, with my other pairing of a rich canary yellow and a navy blue, I did a bright yellow rose and then just a solid blue granny square. So several options, and of course, you know, you can do the whole square, rose included, a single color. I'll explain that in the tutorial. And you can scrap bust. Nothing says this rose has to be one color. You can do it a whole bunch of colors if you want, and then build your square. Lots of options. You know I can't wait to see yours. And if you do make this square and you want to share photos with me and the rest of the community, pop over to our Etsy shop. The link will be in the description box down below. You can click Message Seller. You can attach a photo to your message, and we will be happy to share it with the rest of the community on our community tab here on our YouTube channel. So community tab will also have that linked in the description box down below if you have trouble navigating over to it. Enough chitter chatter. Let's grab our hooks, we'll grab our yarn, we'll head on over to the craft table, and we will stitch up an Irish Rose granny square together. In order to make our magical Irish Rose granny squares, we are going to need around 40 yards in total of a size 4 medium weight yarn. I'm using acrylic and 3 colors today. You need about 12 yards for your flower and around 28 to 30 yards for the rest of the square. You want a pair of scissors, a yarn needle. You might find stitch markers are handy to keep track of where your corners are. And I'm using a 5.5mm hook. This is also known as an eye or a 9. And once you've got all that together, we can get started.
Easily find all of our crochet tutorials. Type youtube.com/JadaandStitches into your web browser and we'll see you there.
This granny square is made all in one piece. So we start with the flower, but we build the actual square onto it. And the Square should be thought of in two parts. The flower is technically 3 rows, but we are also starting the granny square at what is typically considered row 3 of a traditional granny square. But we are putting 4 rows of the traditional shell stitch into the square. So the square will still end on a classic row 6, where you have 6 shells running across each side, but technically this is row 7, only because the flower is part of the square and the flower itself is 3 rows. So 3 rows for the square, and then rows 4, 5, 6, and 7 of the granny square are technically rows 3, 4, 5, and 6 of a classic traditional granny square. And I'll explain a little bit more about that as we get into it. You can have a lot of fun with color in this particular square. You can make your square all one color and your flower a different color. You can make the whole thing one color, and I'll explain how you can do that. It's very easy. Changing color or not changing color is very easy in this particular pattern. Or you could even do your flower in multiple colors if you wanted to. You can stripe every row, every other row, or just make the whole background of the square solid. And of course, you can continue to make this square as large as you like. So the flower will remain the same size, but you can continue to add that shell stitch row until the square is as large as you like if you're making bigger squares. We begin with the flower. So you're going to take your flower color. I'm using yellow. We're going to make a slip knot, and like most of our granny squares, we are going to start with a chain 5. That chain 5 is joined with a slip stitch to the first chain to make a ring. So we have a chain 5 ring, and the first row of our flower of the entire granny square will be worked into this ring. I'm going to work over top of my short tail, but you can weave yours in later if you want to. We're going to create 8 petals for our first row. This is the very center of our flower. We're going to chain 2, double crochet into the circle, chain 2, and slip stitch into the circle. Again, you're working into the circle, not into the individual chains. That's petal number 1. Petal number 2, chain 2, double crochet into the circle, chain 2, and slip stitch into the circle. So every petal is chain 2, double crochet, chain 2, slip stitch, all into the circle. Let's do a third one together. We are going to sort of shove our little petals backwards. So you just sort of grab the circle, grab the last few stitches of your most recent petal, pull them backwards because you need to be able to fit 8 petals in total into this little ring. Chain 2, double crochet into the ring, chain 2, and slip stitch into the ring. That's a petal. That's 3 petals. You want to make 5 more. We're going to have 8 little petals all kind of happily crammed into this little circle by the end of row 1 of the flower. At the end of row 1 of the little flower, you'll have 8 petals. You'll finish that last petal with a chain 2 slip stitch into the ring. So all 8 of your petals are anchored in that ring, and you can sort of see through it. Now we are going to bend the first petal forward. You're going to take a look at those 2 loops on the back of that double crochet that's in the middle of the petal. So there's 2 loops on the back of that double crochet. You can sort of see that there. You're going to slip stitch right into those 2 loops. That's again the 2 loops on the back of the double crochet of this petal. So you've anchored now your yarn with a stitch on the back of that first petal you made. So this is the right side of the flower, this is the wrong side of the flower. We are going to chain 3, skip the next petal, find the petal after that, find the middle double crochet and grab a couple of those loops, so the 2 loops on the back, and slip stitch into it. Chain 3, skip the next petal, find the next one, find the middle stitch, and grab a couple of those loops. Now, to be fair, it doesn't have to be the precise 2 loops of the double crochet. You're just grabbing 2 loops in the middle of that next petal. We are working on the back. This is still technically row 1. So every row of the petal or of the flowers is a row of petals and then a little row of chained spaces built across the back of the flower so that we can build more petals into it. Chain 3. Skip the next petal, find the next one, find the middle stitches, a couple of loops there on the middle back. Typically, I aim for the middle double crochet, but whatever 2 loops look like they're in the back of the petal. And of course, you don't see this from the front. There's the front. Everything looks nice and neat and tidy there. That's 3 chain 3 loops we have so far. We want 4 in total. Chain 3. Skip the next petal, and then you're going to find the first chain 3 loop that you made and slip stitch into the chain 3 loop. So you'll have 4 chain 3 loops, creating a little itty bitty square along the back of your flower. From the front, you can't tell that anything's amiss. Nothing has changed. We've just created 4 chain 3 loops on the back of our flower. They're anchored in every other petal. And now we are going to start row 2 of the flower. This is the second row of petals. And just like row 1, the second row of petals will also have some chained loops anchored on the back of them. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Into this chain 3 loop, we're going to build 2 petals. So every chain 3 loop, there's 4 of them, gets 2 petals so that we continue to have 8 petals all the way around. Here are what the petals look like for row 2 of the flower. Right from where you are, chain 2. Work 2 extended double crochet stitches. Extended double crochet, you start a regular double crochet, pick up a loop, you'll have 3 loops on your hook, yarn over, pull back through 2, chain 1, and yarn over, pull back through 2. That is an extended double crochet. Let's do another one. Yarn over, pick up a loop, yarn over, pull back through 2, chain 1, yarn over, pull back through 2. An extended double crochet is roughly the same height as a treble, but I find extended double crochets are a little easier to build than treble crochets. Chain 2 after your 2 extended double crochets and slip stitch back into the chain 3 loop. That is a medium-sized petal. Let's do another one. Chain 2. 2 extended double crochets into the same chain 3 loop. Chain 2 and slip stitch into the chain 3 loop. That's 2 medium-sized petals built into that chain 3 loop, and the little petals of the first row of the flower sit on top of them. You move to the next chain 3 loop and you slip stitch into it and you make 2 medium-sized petals. Chain 2, 2 extended double crochets, chain 2, slip stitch back into the chain 3 loop, or the chain 3 space, however you want to think about it. Chain 2, 2 extended double crochets, chain 2, and slip stitch back into that chain 3 space. So each of those chain 3 spaces, you'll have 2 left, each get 2 medium petals. Chain 2, 2 extended double crochet, chain 2, slip stitch. You slip stitch into the next chain 3 space to start the next 2 petals, and it's the same thing repeated. I'll let you finish that, and I'll catch up with you at the end of your 8th medium-sized petal. At the end of your petal part of row 2, you'll have 8 medium-sized petals. Each of those petals is chain 2, 2 extended double crochet, chain 2, slip stitch, all worked into one of those 4 chain 3 spaces that you built on the back of row 1 of those little petals. So now you've got 2 rows of petals. And you've slip stitched to finish your last petal into that same last chain 3 space. Same thing as row 1. Now we're going to bend the row 2 petal, the first medium petal, back. We're going to find a couple of loops on the middle double crochet, or one of the middle double crochets, or both of the double crochets. You want to grab 2 loops on the back middle of that flower petal and slip stitch. So we're anchoring our yarn now on the back of the medium-sized petal. This is the wrong side of the flower. This is the right side of the flower. You've got 2 rows of petals, and now we want to build some chain 4 spaces all the way around the back of the medium-sized petals. So we're going to chain 4 now. We're still going to skip a petal and then anchor with a slip stitch in a couple of loops on the back of the next petal. So that's chain 4 space number 1, chain 4, skip a petal, go to the next petal, grab a couple loops on the back of that petal and slip stitch. Chain 4, skip a petal, find the next petal, grab a couple loops back there. Yeah, those 2 look good. Oops. And slip stitch and chain 4. Skip the last petal, and you're going to join with a slip stitch in that chain 4 space you made, that first chain 4 space. So now you've got 4 chain 4 spaces built all the way around the back of your flower. So that's the end of row 2. So each row consists of a little circle of petals and then some chained spaces in which to build the next row. So that's row 1 and row 2 of the flower complete. You'll have 4 chain 4 spaces all the way around on the back of your second row of your flower. If you are changing colors for your flower, so let's say you're really scrap busting, I would really recommend finishing a full row of the petals and then the little chained spaces, and then when you slip stitch to join in that first chain space, you can fasten off, weave in your ends, and then just start your new row of petals with the new color in one of the chained spaces. So if you're changing colors, that's how I recommend it. If you run out though, don't worry, the little chained spaces that you're building on the back of the petals don't really show, so if you have to change colors for that, that's okay too. Let's build petal row number 3. These are the large petals of the flower. We chain 2 to begin. Again, we're going to build 2 petals into each of these chain 4 spaces. So you'll have 8 petals, 2 petals built into each of those 4 chain 4 spaces. Petal begins with a chain 2. We're going to do 3 extended double crochet stitches. So that's chain 2, 3 extended double crochet, chain 2, and slip stitch back into the chain 4 space. So that is a large petal. Chain 2, 3 extended double crochet, chain 2, slip stitch back into the chain 4 space. There are 2 per chain 4 space, so we start chain 2, 3 extended double crochets, chain 2, and slip stitch. So there's your first 2 large petals made for row 3 of the flower, and just like row 2, you slip stitch into the next chain space, you build your 2 petals, and then you slip stitch into the next space, build your 2 petals, slip stitch into the last space, build your 2 petals. Every petal is chain 2, 3 extended double crochet, chain 2, and slip stitch all back into that same chain 4 space. Remember, 2 petals per chain 4 space. You'll have 8 petals at the end of row 3 of the flower, and I will see you there. Once you've finished your 8th large petal, you can take a moment and just kind of put your thumb in the middle of your petal and kind of press the petal edges around your thumb, and that will help make your petals look a little more petally, if that's even a word. And you can do the same thing with row 2 and row 3, or row 1 and row 2 petals as well. And that will just really give that flower a really pretty three-dimensional flower shape. We are not done yet with row 3 of the flower. We've anchored our last petal in the last chain 4 space. Now we need to build some chain 4 spaces around the back of our flower so that we can now build the rest of our square on top of it. So we're going to continue with the flower color, because why not? We are going to continue making chain 4 spaces, but we're going to anchor them in every single petal. So we now want 8 chain 4 spaces all the way around. So we're going to begin by anchoring our yarn on the back of our first petal, our first large petal. Grab a couple loops on the back of that petal. Just aim for the middle. Try to get 2 loops. There we go. Slip stitch, chain 4. And now, instead of skipping a petal, so that's the petal I'm anchored in, you're going to go to the very next petal and slip stitch into a couple of the back loops on the back of that petal. Chain 4. Go to the next petal, find a couple of loops back there, and slip stitch. Chain 4. Go to the next petal, grab a couple loops back there, and slip stitch. So you want a chain 4 space anchored in the back of every single one of those 8 petals all the way around, so that you have 8 chain 4 spaces, and that is what we're going to build the rest of the granny square onto. Your last chain 4 will be anchored in the slip stitch in the first chain 4 space. So anchor with a slip stitch in the first chain 4 space, just like we've been doing all along. So just find the first chain 4 space, slip stitch to join. Double check that you've got 8 of these little chain 4 spaces all the way around. There'll be 1 anchored in the back of each of those petals. Look how lovely and three-dimensional this thing is. I just love that. It's so neat. Fasten off. You can weave in your tail or work over top of it, whatever suits your fancy. And like I said, you can go around and sort of pull out those little petals. Give your flower a little bit of shaping before we move on to the square. You can go back and do this again later on, but I just like things to look pretty as I'm working on them too. Is that just me? So that's our flower made. Like I said, you can change colors for all the individual petal rows if you want. I recommend doing the full row. So the full row of the flower is a row of like a circle of petals, and then the anchoring chain spaces on the back. And then the next row would be petals and then anchoring chain spaces. Next row is petals and anchoring chain spaces. I recommend doing a petal row with the anchoring chain spaces all in one color. If you're changing colors for each row of your little flower. But that's just a personal choice. If you are using up tiny scraps, again, these little parts of the flower, the little chain spaces, don't really show, so don't worry too much about them. But make sure you have 8 as we head into the granny square. So grab the first row of your granny square color and we'll get that going. As previously mentioned, the first row of the granny square, so the square part, the shell stitch aspect of this granny square, is technically row 3 of a traditional granny square. So I'm going to start with my granny square color. This is the first color I'm going to use for row 4. This is row 4 of the granny square. Technically, if you want to think about it in terms of how it equates to a traditional granny square, it's the exact same as the row 3 of a classic granny square. So in any one of those chain 4 spaces, I'm just going to start with the one where my tail is, because I'm going to work over top of my tail. You're going to join your yarn with a slip stitch chain 3. That will count as the first double crochet. You can also join with a double crochet if you feel that's more comfortable. So I'm going to join with a slip stitch chain 3. That's my first double crochet, and we're starting with a corner. Finish with 2 double crochets. This is all worked into that little chain 4 space. There's my first shell. So chain 3 counts as a double crochet. plus 2 double crochet. 3 double crochet together is 1 shell. Before we leave this, we are making a corner. We're going to chain 2. And into that chain 4 space, so we haven't left yet, 3 more double crochet. That will be the second shell of the row. So once again, we are on row 4 of this granny square, but this row of shell stitch equates to a classic granny square row 3. So we'll be looking at row 3 classic granny square shell counts, but this is technically row 4 of this pattern. So not to confuse you further, but this does match up with all the other granny squares in this series. So this row 4 will equate to the same stitch count as the row 3 in all the other granny squares of this series. And I'll catch you up with those numbers at the end of this row. Shell, chain 2, shell, chain 1, that is a corner. So that's the first part of this row complete. Now we can move on to the next little chain 4 space back here. 3 double crochet, equals 1 shell stitch, chain 1, so there's our corner, shell, chain 1, shell, chain 1, only 1 shell in that space. We're into the next chain 4 space, and now we're into another corner. And this will help you see what I mean when I say it equates to a classic granny square shell stitch row 3. 3 double crochet, chain 2, into the same space, 3 more double crochet, and chain 1. So the chain 1s are our little spacers in between regular shells. The chain 2 is the corner. We have 4 chain 2 corner spaces. We'll have 8 chain 1 spaces at the end of this row. Why it equates, I should say, to a classic granny square row 3 is because at the end of a row 3 on a classic granny square, you'll have 3 shells across each side. So shell, shell, shell. This is the beginning of this side. This is the beginning of this side. You'll have 12 shells in total at the end of this row. That's why it equates to a classic granny square row 3. These 12, I should say 3 shells per side plus the little chain 1 spaces in between will give you 11 stitches. So if you'll recall, row 3 at the end of every other square in this series, the end of row 3, every side has 11 stitches, and we don't count the chain 2 corners, we just count the shell stitch or the double crochet stitches and the chains in between. So 3 double crochet per shell, that's 9, plus 2 little spacer stitches, that's 11. So that's why it equates to a row 3. It'll also be the same size. Remember, the first 3 rows of this flower granny square are the flower. The flower is very 3-dimensional, it sits up, so you really can't consider this flower 3 typical rows of a typical granny square. But obviously, I want you to know that you're on row 4 of this square. We've got row 1, row 2, row 3, this is row 4, but it equates to a typical row 3. Okay, so that's the corner made. Don't forget to chain 1 when you finish your last shell. Next space gets 3 double crochet, and you can probably see the pattern happening here. Every other chain 3 space, or chain 4 space I should say, there's 8 chain 4 spaces. You go shell, chain 2 shell, chain 1, corner, into the next one, shell, into the next one, corner, into the next one, shell, into the next one, corner, into the next one, shell. So every other row, or every other chain 4 space is either a corner, and the ones in between, shells. So 3 double crochet, chain 1, next one is a corner. 3 double crochet, chain 2, 3 double crochet, chain 1. I'll let you guys work away at that. The last thing you do will be a shell, or 3 double crochet, chain 1, and we'll be joining with a slip stitch to the top of the first chain 3, but when we get there, I'll show you how it looks. At the end of row 4 of this granny square, we have completed a classic row 3 of the shell stitch granny square. So, excluding our little flower, we've got a corner, a shell, a corner, a shell, a corner, a shell, a corner, and we finish with a shell. You'll have 12 shells all the way around, 3 per side. You'll have 8 chain 1 spaces, so 2 chain 1 spaces per side. We count the chain 1 spaces, we don't count the chain 2 spaces because the chain 2 corner is the same for every row of a typical square. So per side you've got 11 stitches, that's 3, 4, 7, 8, and 11. When you finished your last shell, chain 1, join with a slip stitch in the top of the chain 3 or that standing double crochet. It's the first stitch you started the row with. And here's the magic part. I'm going to pull up on that loop. You're going to find your 4 corners. If you find it helpful, you might want to add little stitch markers to them. You pull out on those 4 corners. I'll add my stitch markers so you can really see them. There we go. So 4 corners, 3 shells per side. That equates to 11 stitches because there's a chain 1 in between each of those shells on each side. The corners are chain 2 spaces, and if you pull out your corners you can really see that first part of the square starting to square up. So your flower is sitting now on top of a small square. That's what it looks like from behind. You've used all 8 of those chain 4 spaces that you built off the back of the 3rd row of the flower, which was those 8 petals. Every petal had a chain 4 space anchored in the back of it, and it worked like there are 4 chain 4 spaces with a corner in it, which is shell, chain 2, shell, chain 1, and the 4 chain 4 spaces in between only have 1 shell or 3 double crochet, chain 1 in it. So that's your little alternating row 3 of a classic granny square, row 4 of this Irish rose granny square. For the next row, we are just doing classic granny square rows from here on out. Very, very familiar to you if you've done the classic granny square along with us. If you want to change colors, you can fasten off right now. I will be doing that. If you're not changing colors, you are going to slip stitch across the next 2 stitches. So across those next 2 stitches and into the chain 2 space. If you are not changing colors, slip stitch into the top of the next 2 stitches, slip stitch into the chain 2 space, and just wait for us. I am changing colors, so if you want to change colors, you join your final row with a slip stitch in the top of the chain 3, or if that was a standing double crochet, you join there. And you don't need to slip stitch into the corner if you are changing colors. So I'm going to fasten off. Again, if you are not changing colors, slip stitch across into the corner space. Just wait for the rest of us. I will be working over top of my short tail, so I'm just going to pull this in and out through the next 2 stitches and into the corner so that I can anchor my yarn over top of it and just work over top of it. I'm going to keep my stitch marker out because that's where I'm joining my yarn. I am now moving to my white color. To join a new color, begin with a slip knot, and you can do the same thing you did to join color for row 4 of this granny square. You can either join with a slip stitch chain 3, which counts as the first double crochet of the row, or you can join with a standing double crochet. Your choice. I'm going to do a slip stitch and a chain 3. So I'm joining in that corner space. We all chain 3 together. So if you just slip stitched in because you didn't change colors, chain 3, that counts as the first double crochet of the row, and now we do a corner. All chain 2 spaces get a corner or corner treatment, 3 double crochet, chain 2, 3 double crochet, chain 1. That is a corner. That's your classic granny square corner. Shell, chain 2, shell. And then before you leave, chain 1. So there is our first corner. Shell, chain 2, shell, 3 double crochet, chain 2, 3 double crochet, and chain 1 for a spacer before we leave. I will continue weaving in my tails later. If you are keeping track of corners, I highly recommend you use your stitch markers. So when you finish with your chain 2 corner, put your stitch marker back in. In row 5 of this granny square, it equates to a classic row 4. So you'll have 4 shells across, but remember, because we added this big fancy flower, this is technically row 5 of this square. 3 double crochet, chain 1, 3 double crochet, chain 1. When you get to your corner, 3 double crochet, chain 2, 3 double crochet, chain 1. So chain 1 spaces get 1 shell. 3 double crochet. I'm going to weave my short tails in later. 3 double crochet. That is a shell. And chain 1 before you leave. You want those chain 1 spacers in there because it keeps our stitch count accurate so that all of these squares in this series will fit together. It also gives us a bit of breathing space so that when we are adding shells into successive rows, you've got some room. 3 double crochet into the next chain 1 space. And chain 1. So that's the little chain 1 space is taken care of. They each get a shell, 3 double crochet, chain 1. When you get to your next chain 2 corner, I have mine marked with a stitch marker. It gets the corner treatment. Shell, chain 2, shell, chain 1. 3 double crochet. That's shell number 1. Chain 2. 3 double crochet into that same corner space. We're turning the corner now. And chain 1 before you leave. You want that little space in between your shells. So one complete side has 4 shells in it and 3 chain 1 spaces. That's 15 stitches across each side for row 5 of this square pattern. Remember that this row 5 equates to a typical row 4 in all the other squares that we've done. So at the end of this row, you'll have 15 stitches. That's 3, 1, 3, 1, 3, 1, 3. And you don't have to count your chain 2 corners as stitches because they're kind of special. The chain 2 corner is continuous through every row. You always have chain 2 corners. So as long as you have 4 in every row, you don't have to really consider them part of the stitch count along each side. Don't forget to chain 1 when you finish with your corner. Every chain 1 space gets 3 double crochet, chain 1. So if it's a chain 1 space, it gets 1 shell. If it's a chain 2 space, it gets 2 shells. Don't forget the chain 2 between your corner shells and the chain 1 before you leave. And this is a classic granny square shell stitch row. So 3 double crochet, chain 1 for a regular shell in a chain 1 space. When you get to a corner, it gets the shell or the corner treatment. Shell, chain 2, shell, chain 1. I'm going to let you work away at the rest of this row 5, and I'll catch up with you at the end. At the end of the row, you finish with a 3 double crochet, chain 1, or a shell, chain 1. You always join with a slip stitch to the top of the chain 3 that you began the row with, or if it was a standing double crochet, the top of that. You'll have 4 shells per side, or 15 stitches per side, plus 4 chain 2 corners. That is the end of row 5 of this square. Remember, row 5 equates to a typical row 4 of all the other granny squares in this series. If you are changing colors, you're going to fasten off right here and join your new color with a slip stitch, chain 3, or a standing double crochet in the next corner. If you're not changing colors, you're going to slip stitch into each of those 2 stitches and into the chain 2 corner. I am changing colors. So if you're not changing colors, slip stitch into the corner, and I'll catch up with you guys there. I'm just going to fasten off. Same thing, I'm just going to kind of bring my tail through those 2 stitches and into the corner so I can join my yarn over top of it, and then I'll weave in the rest a little later on. I am back to blue for row 6. Row 6 of this granny square typically equates to a row 5 of all the other granny squares in the series, so we will have 5 shells across each side, or 19 stitches across each side. We will still have 4 chain 2 corner spaces. And all the other rules are the same. If it's a chain 2 space, it gets 2 shells. Shell, chain 2, shell, chain 1, that's a corner. If it's a chain 1 space, it gets 1 shell, or 3 double crochet, chain 1. We join with a slip stitch, chain 3. If you slip stitched into this corner because you weren't changing colors, chain 3. So we're all at the beginning of row 6 of this square. 2 more double crochet into the corner. That is your first shell. We are in a chain 2 space. It gets the corner treatment. We chain 2 for the new corner. 3 more double crochet into the same corner space. And chain 1. Don't forget the chain 1 space. It gets you a new space prepared for the shell that will be eventually sitting in it in the next row. So shell, chain 2, shell, chain 1, that's the corner. Every chain 1 space gets a shell. 3 double crochet. And a new chain 1 spacer. And that is how every row goes. If it's a chain 1 space, it gets a shell. 3 double crochet, chain 1, into the chain 1 spaces. You'll have 3 of them across each side now, just single shells. 3 double crochet, chain 1. When you get to a corner space, I just put my corner stitch markers back in. It's a chain 2 space, it's a corner, it gets the corner treatment. Shell, chain 2, shell, chain 1, or 3 double crochet, chain 2, 3 double crochet, chain 1. You know the drill. I'm going to let you guys work away at this row on your own. I'll catch up with you at the end and we will do a quick shell count together. At the end of row 6, you will have 5 shells across each side and 4 chain 1 spaces. You'll have 4 chain 2 corner spaces in total. So remember that will be 19 stitches across each side in total. 5 shells equals 15 plus 4 chain 1 spaces. That's 19 stitches per side, and then your 4 chain 2 corners on top of that. Finish the row with your last 3 double crochet, chain 1, and slip stitch to join in the top of the chain 3, or the standing double crochet. And pause, take a moment to pull out your corners. This is just looking like a picture. I am changing colors for my final row. You know the drill. If you're not changing colors, slip stitch across into the chain 2 corner space. Wait for us there. Otherwise, fasten off. If you're changing colors, I'm just going to pull my yarn through to the corner. I'm going to switch back to white for my final row, joining with I've got a slip knot on my hook. I'm going to remove that stitch marker. Join with a slip stitch in the corner space. Chain 3 to begin. We all chain 3 to begin the row. Finish that shell with 2 more double crochet. We are starting in a corner, so the corner space gets the corner treatment. Say it with me. Shell, chain 2, shell, chain 1 before you leave. Each of those chain 1 spaces gets 1 shell, or 3 double crochet, and a chain 1. Don't forget your little chain 1 spacers. They count. They help keep our stitch count accurate and consistent all the way through this series. So chain 2 corner space gets 3 double crochet, chain 2, 3 double crochet, chain 1. Every little chain 1 space in between, and for this row there will be 4 of them, so don't miss them. 3 double crochet, chain 1 in each of those chain 1 spaces all the way across. I'll let you guys work away at that. This is very familiar by now. This is just your classic shell stitch. I will hook up with you at the end of row 7. This is technically row 7 of this square, but it equates to a row 6 of a classic granny square, or a row 6 of any other square in this series. And we'll have a little stitch count party at the end of the row. I'll catch up with you there. At the end of row 7, join with a slip stitch to the top of the chain 3. You can now fasten off and weave in all of your tails. If you are making a bigger square, you just continue with the pattern. If you need to change colors, you just fasten off, join with a new color in the corner. If you're not changing colors, slip stitch across into the corner, and the pattern is the same. Chain 3 to begin, 2 double crochet, chain 2, 3 double crochet, chain 1. That just completes your corner. All corners are shell, chain 2, shell, chain 1. If it's a chain 1 space, it gets shell, chain 1, or 3 double crochet, chain 1. And every row will continue to add 1 shell per side and 1 chain 1 space per side, or 4 shells in total, 4 chain 1 spaces in total, but your chain 2 corners remain the same. They don't change. And then you can just make this square as large as you want. Remember though, the little flower will always be the same size, so the bigger the square, the smaller the flower will look. But if you're making a granny square that equates to, say, 10 rows, or with the other squares in this series, remember that will be a row 11 you're finishing on. You're always going to be one more little row ahead, just because we count the 3 rows that are in this flower. But every row outside of that equates with the row before it in terms of stitch count. At the end of this row, row 7, it equates to a row 6 of a typical granny square. You'll have 6 shells across, 5 chain 1 spaces in between, or a total of 23 stitches per side, and then your chain 2 corner spaces on top of that. You can fasten off, weave in your tails, take out your stitch markers, and my favorite part is pulling out the little corners, giving it a little light blocking with your hand, and just standing back and taking a look at that lovely little square. Once your tails are woven in, you're all done. And that is the Granny's Magical Cupboard version of the Irish Rose Granny Square. I hope you enjoyed stitching that up along with us this week. I really like the textured aspect of this square. It's the most three-dimensional, most textured version of a square we've done so far this year. And I love the idea of a flower in a square. I have experimented with flower-centered granny squares for several years now, and I really have always liked the concept of the Irish Rose Granny Square because it's a three-dimensional rose or a three-dimensional flower that's built into a square. And I've tried a lot of different patterns, many over the years, but until now I felt that the flowers were either too big or too open in the middle, or the petals were too large, or it took too long to get to the square, or maybe the square was a little too gappy in places. Anyway, this year was the perfect excuse to just go ahead and design my own. So that's what I did. And I hope you guys enjoyed making this up along with me as much as I enjoyed it. I really want to try this now in a multiple colored, variegated or self-striping rose against a solid color background. I think that would look really pretty, like an actual garden, a bunch of different colored roses on just a solid color background. Kind of like this, but you know, maybe some more color to the rose. I might try changing every row of the rose in color, so sort of striping the rose. I might try just a really pretty garden party-esque kind of variegated yarn. Sky's the limit. I love when there are so many different color options for a granny square, and it'll change the way it looks every single time. That's all cool too. Anyway, that was the 6th square in this year's calendar blanket. If you've got photos, please feel free to share them with us, and we will share them with the community at large. You can click on the Etsy shop link in the description box down below, click message seller, attach a photo to your message, and we will be happy to include it in a roundup on the community tab of our YouTube page here. And if you feel like picking up the written pattern of today's pattern or any of the other square patterns in this series, you'll find those in our Etsy shop too. And a big thank you to everybody who has picked up a pattern. It really does help support us here and keep us going. So thank you very much. And with that, have a wonderful rest of your day. Have a wonderful weekend. The beautiful weather is here. I love this time of year. And stay safe and crafty as usual. We'll see you guys soon. Bye!
Hi everybody, Mr. InStitches here. Thank you for watching today. Here are some of our other videos you might be interested in. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe.